There is a specific kind of silence that means you have made a very large mistake in front of a very large number of people. I would come to know it well. The first time I heard it, I was standing in the middle of the king's selection hall, with my hand wrapped around a stranger's arm, having just announced to 400 wolves that he was my mate, watching every single one of them go down on one knee. Not to me, you understand. To him. I had perhaps 2 heartbeats to revise my entire understanding of my own life. I used the first one to notice that the stranger's arm under my hand had not so much as twitched, and the second to look up at the face I had been too panicked to check before I claimed it, and find the King of the Grey North looking down at me with an expression I can only describe as a man who has just been handed, unasked, the one thing he most needed and least expected, and is deciding very fast what to do with it. "There you are," Magnus said, loud enough for the kneeling hall, as though he had been looking for me, and then, much quieter, only for me, with the driest amusement I have ever heard in a human voice bold. "Keep your nerve. You have no idea the favor you have just done me." I did not, in fact, have any idea. Let me go back 3 breaths, to the selection, and the reason a sensible woman grabs the first arm she can reach. My name was Rosalind, I was 25, and I was the assistant keeper of the fortress archive, which is a long way of saying I lived among books and was paid in candle stubs, and considered this an excellent arrangement. I had spent 6 years making myself indispensable to the one room in the Grey North where no one of rank ever went. The archive, 3 floors of cold vellum under the library, where the pack kept its treaties and its bloodlines and its grudges in ink. It suited me. I am dry by nature and bookish by trade, and I have never once in my life wanted to be looked at, which is a rare and valuable temperament in a fortress full of people who want nothing else. I had a life made entirely of being overlooked, and I had built it on purpose, brick by quiet brick, and I would have died happy in it. And then pack law came for me, the way it eventually comes for everyone. The royal selection of the Grey North was held every 3rd autumn when the Alpha King sat unmated past his prime. Every unmated woman of age in the territory presented at court, so his wolf might seek the bond, and so the great houses might press their daughters forward, and so the lowest stillroom girl stood in the same line as the highest noble. The law had been widened that year to drag in every unmated woman of age. No exceptions, no station too low to be exempt, which meant that for the first time in 6 years, the archive's invisible keeper was required to put on a borrowed dress and stand in the light. I did not want to be claimed. I want to be clear that this was not maidenly nerves. I had a life I loved, and it was made of solitude and ink, and the selection did not only offer me to the king, it offered me to any lord present who wished to bid a dowry for a free-born woman the king passed over, which most of us were. To be claimed was to be carried off to some warrior's hall to bear his pups and never see a book again. I would rather have been buried in the archive than married out of it. So I made a plan, in the way of a woman who has read every law the Grey North has ever written and knows exactly where the loopholes are buried. There was an old clause, older than the selection itself, that a woman already mated could not be offered. A claimed wolf was not selection stock, and the right did not, in its ancient and badly drafted wording, require the mate to be present to verify the claim at the moment of the selection. It required only that she name him, and that he, when found, not deny it. My plan was elegant and stupid in exactly the proportions that get a person into trouble. I would stand in the line, and when the stewards reached me, I would seize the nearest unremarkable man, a guard, a servant, some forgettable wolf of no rank, and declare him my mate, loudly, and trust to the chaos, and my own forgettableness, to get us both quietly out the side door, before anyone checked. A nobody claiming a nobody. Beneath notice. The whole strategy was beneath notice. It was the only strategy I had ever been good at. If you have ever built your entire safety on being too small to be seen, and then watched, in a single horrible moment, the thing you grabbed to stay hidden turn around and make you the most seen person in the room, then you already know the feeling I am about to describe. Stay with me, because the reason the king let a stranger claim him in front of his whole court is not the reason you think, and it is not the reason I thought either, and when I finally learned it, it turned out he was in far more danger that day than I was. Follow along. He had a plan too. His was worse than mine. Here is what I did not account for, being a woman who lived underground among documents and rarely looked up. I did not know what the king looked like. I had been the king's archivist for 6 years and I had never once seen him, because the king does not come to the archive and the archivist does not go to court, and I had been perfectly content with the arrangement. I knew his seal. I knew his signature, a hard, fast hand I had filed 1,000 times. I would have known his handwriting in the dark. His face was a stranger's to me, so when the stewards reached me in the line, and panic closed my throat, and I reached blindly for the nearest tall, unremarkable man, standing a little apart from the dais. A man in a plain dark tunic with no crown and no obvious rank. Exactly the forgettable wolf my plan required. And I wrapped my hand around his arm and said, in a voice that came out far steadier than I felt, "You needn't trouble the stewards with me. This one is already mine." I genuinely believed I had grabbed a guardsman. I had grabbed Magnus, king of the Grey North, standing apart from his own dais because he had stepped down from it for one moment, between candidates, to breathe. And he turned, and the hall saw whose arm the archive girl had seized, and 400 wolves went down on one knee. And I learned the silence I told you about at the start. I have replayed the next part more times than I will admit, because it is the part where a sensible man would have peeled my hand off his arm and had me removed, and instead the king of the Grey North did the single most baffling thing I had ever witnessed, which was to play along. "There you are," he said to the kneeling hall, and then, "Lo, keep your nerve. You have no idea the favor you have just done me." And then, louder, to the steward, in the flat tone of a man stating settled fact, "The keeper of my archive and I have an understanding of long standing. She is not for the selection. She never was. Continue without us." And he set his free hand over mine where it was frozen on his arm, not gripping, just covering. The way you steady something that might bolt. And he walked me out of his own selection through the side door I had planned to use, past the kneeling court, with the absolute unhurried confidence of a man who had arranged the entire thing, which he had not, and which only the two of us in that whole hall knew. In the corridor he let go of my hand and looked at me, and his face did a complicated thing that resolved after a moment into open and delighted amusement. 6 years, he said. "I have signed your requisitions for 6 years. Candle stubs and vellum and that absurd quantity of ink. I have wondered who was reading down there. I did not picture you walking up into my selection to commit fraud against pack law with my own arm as the instrument." He paused. It was good fraud. The clause is real. I checked it myself, years ago, for entirely different reasons. You read the law better than my advocates. "You are the king," I said. It was all I had. I am. You may want to sit down. You have gone the color of old parchment. He was already, I would learn, incapable of not noticing things like the color of a person, which is a trait I had thought was mine alone. Before you faint in my corridor, understand one thing. You did not trap yourself just now. You think you did. You are wrong. You walked into the middle of a trap that was closing on me, and you jammed it open by accident, and I am not going to let you take it back. He smiled, and it was not a king's smile. It was a man's. We are going to have to be mated now, you and I. Loudly, and convincingly, and for a while. I will explain why over the very large drink you are about to need. The why was this, and it is the thing the title of my own story does not know. The selection had been a trap with the king's own foot in it. There was a house in the grey north, Lord Bercy's house, old and powerful and patient, that had spent a decade maneuvering its daughter, Lady Solveig, toward the throne. There was an understanding, never quite a betrothal, that Bercy had spent 10 years and a fortune treating as a debt the king owed. And the widens selection that year, the one that had dragged me up out of my archive, had been Bercy's doing, pushed through the council so that Solveig might be formally chosen before the whole north. In a right the king could not refuse without insulting the most dangerous house in his territory and risking the war his father had spent a life avoiding. Magnus had walked into that hall knowing it. Knowing that his wolf had never once stirred for Solveig, that the bond was not there and never would be, and that pack law and politics were about to force him to claim a woman his own beast would not have, in front of his entire court, with no lawful way out that did not start a feud. Because a king cannot simply decline the most powerful daughter in the north without a reason the law will accept. And then a furious archive girl had grabbed his arm and handed him, unasked, the one reason the law would accept. A prior claim. An existing mate. The single clause that voids a selection before it begins. You gave me an exit I could not build for myself, he said, over the very large drink, in a small warm room off the library that I would later learn was the only room in the fortress he liked. If I had announced I was already mated, Bercy would have demanded the name and the proof and torn it apart in a day. But I did not announce it. You did. A nobody. In public. With my own arm. Bercy cannot challenge a thing the king did not claim, only confirmed. You did the most dangerous part for me, and you did it before either of us could think better of it. He turned his cup once on the table, a small, precise motion. Which means I owe you a debt I cannot pay, and a deception I cannot survive alone. So, will you stay, and be falsely mated to the king of the grey north, until I have unmade Bercy's trap by other means? You may say no. I will find another road. But I would very much rather you said yes, and not only because of the politics, which I will deny if you repeat it. I should have said no. I had a life made of solitude, and I had just been offered the loudest possible end to it. Something turned over in me at that table, though, and it did not turn back. I had spent 6 years certain that the safe thing, the only thing, was to stay too small to be seen. And here was the most powerful man in the north telling me that the one time I had stepped up into the light and grabbed something, I had not ruined my life. I had saved his. That the visibility I had spent 6 years fleeing was not the danger I had built it into. That I had, for once, been exactly large enough. Yes, I said. But I have terms, and the first one is that I keep the archive. Done, said the king, far too quickly, and I understood much later that he would have agreed to nearly anything, and that this was the first sign of a great deal of trouble. The trouble was that Magnus, having been handed a false mating, decided to court me as though it were a real one. And Magnus courted the way other men wage war. I have to explain what kind of man he was, because it is the whole comedy of those weeks, and the whole tenderness underneath it. Magnus of the Grey North ruled a territory with effortless, easy command. He had never lost a battle, or a negotiation, or an argument with anyone of rank in his life, and he had absolutely no idea how to make a woman like him, and rather than admit this, he approached it as a campaign, with planning, with logistics, with what I can only call a strategy. His wolf had no such difficulty. That was the other thing. Because his wolf, The great gray beast that had stayed mysteriously silent through every noble daughter Bercy had paraded, had decided, the instant I grabbed its king's arm and called him mine, that the matter was settled. A vow had been spoken. As far as the wolf was concerned, the deception was not a deception at all. It was simply true, and the king was merely slow to catch up, as the king was slow about most things that mattered. And the wolf set about making the lie real, with the single-minded devotion of an animal that cannot conceive of being wrong. It would not leave my archive. It lay across the bottom of the stair like a gray rug with opinions. When Magnus came down to court me with whatever he had planned that day, and he always had a plan, I once caught a glimpse of an actual written list in his hard, fast hand, which I have never let him forget. The wolf would arrange itself between us in a way that left the king no dignified option but to sit closer to me than he had intended, and then look faintly betrayed about it. I watched the king of the Grey North try to conduct a stately, strategic courtship while his own wolf undercut him at every turn, bringing me things in front of the council, refusing to let him leave my door, leaning its full weight against my legs at formal dinners, while Magnus addressed the architecture of the ceiling and pretended not to know whose beast it was. I watched a man who had never lost an argument lose a sustained and silent war to his own instincts, over me, in front of his entire court. It was the funniest thing I had ever seen. I did not laugh. It cost me everything I had not to. Your wolf, I told him once, appears to believe the thing we are pretending. My wolf, Magnus said, with great dignity, watching the beast deposit a heron's feather in my lap as though presenting a treaty, has always been a romantic. It is his worst quality. I do not share it. You made a list, I said. He did not quite color. I made a plan. There is a difference. There is a written plan in your hand for how to make me fond of you, and step 4 was discuss the archive. She likes the archive. Step 4 was sound, said the king of the Grey North, with the wounded pride of a man whose campaign is going better than he will admit. And you are, in fact, fond of me, so I will thank you not to mock my methods. I was. That was the trouble with all of it. The lie had started as politics, and the courtship had started as strategy, and somewhere in those weeks both had quietly stopped being either. And the only two people who had not yet said so were the two of us, while a wolf who had known since the first day watched us be slow about it. Lady Solveig did not find any of it funny. She had come to the selection certain of the outcome. Her whole house was certain, 10 years certain, and she had watched a feather-light archive girl void the entire right with one sentence and the king's own arm. And she did not believe for one moment that the king of the Grey North had a long-standing secret mate hidden in his cellar, because no one who knew Magnus believed he could keep a secret that warm and say nothing for years. She knew it was a lie. She simply had to prove it. She moved twice, and the second nearly took everything. The first was public and clever. At a court audience, Lady Solveig rose and asked, with great courtesy, that the king's mate be presented for the bond right, the old verification, in which a claimed pair stands before the pack and the bond is witnessed, the warmth of it felt by the assembled wolves, a thing no false pair can counterfeit. It was her right to ask. It was the one test our deception could not pass, because there was no bond to witness, only two people pretending, and a wolf who wished they would not. The king delayed it on procedure, because the king was very good at procedure. But a delay is not an escape, and we both knew the right was coming, and that when it came, the lie would die in front of the whole North, and Bercy's trap would snap shut after all, and I would be exposed as a fraud against pack law, which carried a punishment I had read about in my own archive and did not care to experience. That was the night I went looking through the archive for a way out, a precedent, a clause, anything, and found, instead, the second thing Solveig's house had done, which they had not meant me to find. Because the archive was mine, and I knew every shelf in it, and I noticed when a thing had been moved. Someone had been into the bloodline records. Someone had pulled the rolls of Lord Bercy's own house, and had altered them, recently, in a hand that was not the original, adding a line of descent that gave Solveig a blood claim to the throne that her house did not truly hold, a forged inheritance meant to make her not merely a desirable match, but a lawful heir, whose claim the king could not refuse at all. The trap had never been only the selection. The selection was the soft version. If the marriage failed, the forgery was the hard one, a manufactured bloodline that would let Bercy's house take the throne by law whether the king consented or not, and the king, who did not haunt his own archive, would never have known the documents had been touched. I had grabbed the king's arm to escape a husband. I had walked, without knowing it, into the middle of a quiet coup, and I was the only person in the grey north who had read enough cold vellum to see it. I want to tell the end plainly, because it is where the comedy goes quiet, and the cost comes in. The bond right came, as it had to, in the great hall before the full court, and Lord Bercy's whole house, and the southern witnesses Solveig had been careful to invite. Magnus and I were to stand before the pack and have the bond witnessed, and there was no bond, and we both knew the lie was about to die in the most public way the North allowed. Here is the part the title of my own story does not know. Everyone in that hall, Bercy, Solveig, the king's own anxious council, expected that if anyone was saved that day, it would be the archive girl, saved by the king, that the powerful man would find some way to shield the nobody who had stumbled into his trouble. That is the story they had all written in their heads. They had the rescue backwards. Because I did not stand up to be witnessed, I stood up to speak. I had the altered bloodline rolls under my arm, my evidence, 4 years of cold reading made suddenly into a blade, and before the right could begin and expose us, I addressed the hall in the flat, dry voice of a woman who has read every law the North has ever written. Before the bond is witnessed, I said, into the waiting silence, the law requires that the claims of all parties be lawful. Lady Solveig's house has asked this court to weigh her claim against mine. I am the keeper of this fortress's archive. I have weighed it. I laid the rolls open on the floor where the southern witnesses could see. Her claim is forged. The bloodline that makes her a lawful heir was written into these records within the month, in a hand that is not the recorder's, over an erasure I can show you under lamplight. I did not come here to be the king's mate. I came here to keep his records honest, and his records say that the house demanding his throne has been counterfeiting its right to it. The hall did not go to its knees that time. It went to its feet. And Lord Bercy, 20 years patient, made the single mistake patient men make when their long work is undone in a moment by someone they never thought to watch. He reached for the blade at his belt, there in the king's hall, because a forged claim exposed before southern witnesses was a death sentence, and he knew it. And he went not for the king, but for me, the archivist, the only one who could read the proof. And the king of the grey north, who had spent 6 weeks pretending I was his mate, stopped pretending. He put himself between Bercy's blade and me before I had finished my sentence, and his wolf, who had believed the vow real since the first hour, came down off the dais like grey weather and put Lord Bercy on the floor of the hall he had meant to steal. The blade had opened the king's forearm where he had taken it instead of letting it reach me. A bright line, a wash of red across the hand that had covered mine in the corridor 6 weeks before. Not her, Magnus said, to the whole frozen hall, with his blood running and his wolf at a traitor's throat. Anyone but her. You should have watched the archive. Bercy, everyone in this fortress overlooked the woman in the cellar. So did I, for 6 years. It was the most expensive mistake any of us ever made, and I am the only one glad of it. The court ratified what the wolf had known all along. In the end, There was a bond right, after all. Weeks later. A real one. Witnessed and warm and impossible to counterfeit. Because by then, there was nothing left to counterfeit. I will not give you the moment it became true between us in fine detail. It was quiet, and it was in the small warm room off the library, and what broke open in me when it landed was not what I had spent 6 years guarding against. It was relief. The particular relief of a woman who built her whole life on being unseen, finally being looked at by someone who had been reading her requisitions for 6 years and wondering who she was, and finding the room warmer for it. The wolf was insufferable about the entire thing. It had been right since the first hour, and it knew it. 6 months later, the archive is still mine. I negotiated it in writing, and Magnus, who respects a well-drafted clause more than almost anything, has honored it to the letter, though he now finds an astonishing number of reasons to require the king's personal attention in the cellar. Lord Bercy stood his trial before the whole North and the southern witnesses he had been so careful to invite, his forgery laid open roll by roll in my own hand, and was stripped of his house's standing and sent north to a cold and minor holding to be exactly what he had tried to make me, overlooked and harmless, and never again asked anything by anyone who matters. Lady Solveig, who I am inclined to believe knew less of the forgery than her father, was sent south to a quieter life. She sent me, a season later, a single cold civil note, acknowledging that I read the law better than her advocates, which from Solveig is very nearly an embrace. Magnus still makes lists. He cannot help it. I find them everywhere. Strategies for our anniversary, campaigns for winning over my disapproving old archive master, a written plan, which I was not meant to see, titled Simply Make Her Stay. I have never told him it was unnecessary. I keep it in the archive, in fact, in the one drawer that is only mine. Filed under the day a panicked woman grabbed the wrong arm and accidentally saved a kingdom from a lie. It is the most valuable document I own. A letter came last week from the town I was born in, where they had heard, the way the whole world eventually hears, that the archive girl who never came up into the light was Luna of the Grey North now. They wanted to know how. How a woman who spent 6 years making sure no one saw her ended up mated to the king in front of 400 wolves. I have thought about how to answer. I think I will tell them the truth, which is the only thing a keeper of records is good for. I grabbed the first man I could find to escape being seen, and he turned out to be the one man whose seeing me would change everything. And the worst plan of my life turned out to be the best thing I ever did. I spent 25 years certain that the safe thing was to stay too small to notice. It turns out the only thing more dangerous than being seen is spending your whole life making sure you never are. I grabbed an arm in a panic and held on. Reader, I have never let go, and I have never once been sorry. So tell me, when his wolf stayed silent through every great daughter in the north, and then decided, the instant I grabbed his king's arm, that the lie was simply true. Do you think the beast knew something the man did not, the whole time? Or do you think even the wolf was only guessing, and got lucky, the way I did? I lived it, and I still cannot decide. Tell me your theory below. And if you want to know what Lord Bercy does with his patience in that cold northern holding, and whether Solveig's cold civil notes ever warm, comment the list, and I will know there is more of this to tell. Stay with me, that story is already being written, and you will want it before the rest of the North does. Where are you listening from tonight?